Rust and cheap industrial bleach never truly leave your pores. Even now, pressing trembling palms against expensive mahogany, a metallic jailhouse tang still coats my tongue. He smiled while a gavel cracked, condemning me to 20 years. My body broke on freezing concrete, lungs collapsing, shivering into dark nothingness. But death refused to keep me. It spat me back out. Today, my fingers grip a heavy pen, and my mind is drafting his final verdict. I didn't wake up with a gasp. There was no cinematic jolt, no dramatic cold sweat. 1 second, I was staring at the water-stained ceiling of cell block D, feeling the sharp, agonizing burn of a ruptured appendix turning my insides to poison. The next, I was blinking at the harsh, blue-white glare of a Dell monitor. My lungs pulled in air, real air, not the stale, sweat-soaked oxygen of the penitentiary, but the heavily conditioned, slightly ozone-scented air of the 42nd floor at Omnicorp Logistics. I didn't move. My hands lay flat on the keyboard, fingers resting lightly on the home keys. The plastic felt textured, slightly greasy. I stared at the lower right corner of the screen. October 12th, 9:14 a.m. 4 years ago, I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting the illusion to shatter, expecting the cold concrete to press back against my spine. Instead, the low, vibrating hum of the central AC washed over me, accompanied by the muffled staccato of a dozen people typing in the adjacent cubicles. "Nora?" The voice hit the back of my neck like a physical blow. My stomach plummeted, a heavy, sick drop that left me dizzy. The acid rose in my throat. I knew that voice. I had heard it in my nightmares, echoing over the gavel's crack, slipping through the receiver of the prison visitation telephone. I turned my chair slowly. The casters squeaked against the thin industrial carpet. Caleb stood leaning against the partition of my cubicle. He looked exactly as he had the day he ruined my life. Crisp navy suit, a tie the color of crushed blueberries, his dark hair parted with practiced, casual perfection. He held a ceramic mug of coffee. The suffocating scent of his cedarwood cologne drifted over to me, mingling with the bitter smell of the dark roast. "You in there, Nora?" He offered a small, crooked smile, the one the senior partners loved, the one I used to think was charming. I stared at his throat, at the soft dip of his collarbone, visible just above his tie knot. My right hand, resting on my desk, twitched toward the metal letter opener sitting by my pen cup. It would be so easy. A single, violent thrust. I could feel the imaginary resistance of his skin tearing, the warmth of the blood. The urge was so sudden, so incredibly violent, that my own breath hitched. But I'm not a killer, and a quick death in an office chair was too good for him. "Yeah," I croaked. My voice sounded thin, dusty. I cleared my throat, forcing the muscles in my face to relax, to arrange themselves into the mild, eager-to-please expression I used to wear like a second skin. Just zoned out for a second. "The spreadsheet is a lot," Caleb chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. "Don't burn out on me. We have the quarterly review coming up. Speaking of which, I just dropped a batch of vendor approvals in your shared drive. Give them a look when you have a minute. Just need your sign-off to clear the queue." There it was. The trap. In my previous life, I had clicked through those approvals without a second thought. I trusted him. He was the senior project manager. I was the ambitious junior analyst, eager to prove my worth. I didn't know those vendor files were dummy corporations. I didn't know the materials we were approving were dangerously substandard components that would eventually cause the catastrophic warehouse fire in Chicago. 3 people died in that fire, and when the federal investigators came knocking, Caleb had conveniently scrubbed his metadata. All the approvals, all the digital fingerprints, led straight to my terminal, my login, my IP address, my naive, trusting signature. "Sure," I said. I forced my lips to stretch into a smile. The muscles in my cheeks trembled. "I'll get to them before lunch." "You're a lifesaver, Nora." He tapped the partition twice with his knuckles and walked away. I watched him go. I watched the confident roll of his shoulders. I waited until he rounded the corner, out of sight. Then I stood up, walked briskly to the women's restroom down the hall, went into the furthest stall, locked the door, and threw up. The smell of bile and industrial lemon cleaner filled the small space. I leaned my forehead against the cold, painted metal of the stall wall, panting. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't form a fist. I wasn't some cold, calculating mastermind. I was a 30-year-old woman who had just died a miserable, agonizing death and woken up sitting next to her murderer. I stayed there for 10 minutes. I pressed my palms against the tiles, grounding myself in the physical reality of the present. The porcelain was cold. The toilet paper was scratchy. I was alive. I wasn't in prison. I flushed, walked to the sinks, and turned on the cold tap. The water numbed my wrists as I held them under the stream. I looked at myself in the mirror. No hollow cheeks, no prison pallor, no gray streaks in my dark hair. I looked young, exhausted, but young. He wants a scapegoat, I thought, drying my hands on a rough paper towel. He thinks I'm an easy mark. He thinks I'm blind. I balled the paper towel up and tossed it into the trash can. It landed with a dull thud. I'm going to let him build his gallows, but when the floor drops, he's going to be the one standing on the trapdoor. By the time I returned to my desk, the nausea had faded into a dull, throbbing ache at the base of my skull. It felt like caffeine withdrawal, only sharper. I sat down and nudged the mouse. The monitor woke up. I navigated to the shared drive. Folder, Q3_logistics, _approvals, _drafts. I hovered the cursor over the icon. My heart kicked against my ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. If I deleted the folder right now, Caleb would know I was onto him. If I refused to sign them, he'd find someone else to take the fall. Or worse, he'd forge my credentials anyway. In my past life, the forensics team proved that while some approvals were clicked from my machine, others were spoofed using a backdoor installed on my system. I couldn't just avoid the trap. I had to rewire it. I opened the folder, 12 PDFs. I clicked the first one, Apex Industrial Supplies. The company didn't exist. The address listed on the invoice was a strip mall in Delaware. I knew this because my public defender had shown me the photographs during my trial. Right before he advised me to take a plea deal, I ultimately rejected. I didn't sign the document. Instead, I minimized the window. I needed to see exactly how he was routing the data. I wasn't a cybersecurity expert, but I had spent 4 years in a cell with a woman named Darlene, who used to embezzle millions using network latency tricks. You learn a lot when you have nothing but time and a cellmate who likes to talk. I opened the command prompt on my machine, a black box with white text. I typed in a simple network tracing command, pointing it at the shared drive's server pathway. The text scrolled rapidly, lines of code and IP addresses flashing by. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the screen, scanning the numbers. There, a routing exception. Whenever a file in that specific folder was modified, The network didn't just log it on the main server. It bounced a hidden carbon copy to an internal IP address. I memorized the last 3 digits, *114. I pulled up the employee directory on the internet, clicked on the IT department's floor map, and cross-referenced the static IP blocks. IP.114, Caleb's office terminal. A sharp, humorless laugh escaped my lips. It was so arrogant, so sloppy. He had set up an automated script to mirror the files he needed, quietly scraping my digital signature data and storing it on his machine so he could apply it to the worst offenses later, masking his own tracks. He assumed IT would never look at a senior PM's localized traffic, and he was right. They never did, until the feds brought in their own auditors. And by then, Caleb had wiped his drive, claiming he lost his laptop at an airport. My hands stopped shaking. The paralyzing fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused clarity. It felt like I was submerged in ice water. "Hey, Nora." I nearly jumped out of my skin. I instinctively slapped the space bar, minimizing the command prompt, just as a shadow fell over my desk. It was Greg from accounting, holding a stack of manila folders. He looked confused by my sudden flinch. "Whoa, easy. Didn't mean to spook you. You want in on the lunch order? We're doing that Thai place down on 4th. My chest heaved. I forced a breath out through my nose. "Sorry, Greg. Just deep in the numbers. No, I brought something today. Thank you, though." "Suit yourself," he said, dropping a folder in my outbox. "Don't work too hard. Caleb's got you grinding, huh?" "Something like that," I muttered. When Greg walked away, I pulled up the command prompt again. I couldn't hack Caleb's machine to delete the script. That would trigger a security alert. But I didn't need to delete it. I just needed to poison the well. I opened a basic text editor. I started writing a batch file. It was rudimentary, dirty code. A simple, recursive loop. If Caleb's script was pulling data from my terminal to mask his actions, I was going to attach a silent payload to every file I touched. A tiny, invisible tag that recorded the MAC address of the machine executing the final save command. When he inevitably copied my signature and applied it to the catastrophic safety waivers on his own computer, my little tag would embed itself deep in the document's EXIF data, screaming Caleb's unique hardware identifier. He thought he was painting my face on his crimes. I was just slipping a mirror in front of the canvas. I saved the batch file, hid it in a buried system directory, and linked it to the Adobe Acrobat executable. Then I opened the 12 fake invoices. One by one, I clicked the digital approval stamp. Click, click, click. Every click felt like tightening a noose. But this time, it wasn't around my neck. My apartment smelled like old dust and cheap vanilla candles. Walking through the front door that evening was a bizarre, out-of-body experience. I hadn't seen this place in 4 years. The faded green sofa, the stack of unread magazines on the glass coffee table, the small kitchen with the leaking faucet. I dropped my keys on the counter. They made a sharp, clinking sound that echoed in the quiet room. In my memory, I had lost this apartment 3 months after my arrest. The bank foreclosed. Everything I owned was shoved into cardboard boxes and sold or thrown away. Standing here now, running my fingers over the rough fabric of the sofa, it felt fragile, like a movie set that might fall over if I pushed too hard. I didn't turn on the main lights. I went straight to the fridge, pulled out a bottle of tap water, and pressed the cold plastic against my forehead. I was exhausted. My bones ached with a deep, phantom fatigue. I needed to secure my home network. Caleb wasn't just relying on office tracking. In the trial, they presented evidence that I had logged into the company VPN from my home IP late at night to finalize the fraudulent transfers. He had remote accessed my home router. I sat cross-legged on the floor in front of my personal laptop. The screen cast a pale, ghostly glow across the dark living room. I logged into my router's admin panel. The password was still default. Admin123. Stupid, I whispered to myself in the empty room. God, I was so stupid. I changed the password. But that wasn't enough. If I locked him out completely, right now, he'd notice. He'd find another way to frame me. Or worse, he'd get spooked and abort the current plan, leaving me with no way to prove his guilt. I needed him to think he still had control. I spent the next 4 hours building a honeypot. My eyes burned. I chewed on the inside of my cheek until I tasted the familiar, metallic tang of blood. I drank 3 cups of instant coffee that tasted like burnt dirt. I partitioned my hard drive. I created a fake virtual machine that mirrored my actual operating system. I left the virtual machine completely exposed, ripe for remote access. Then, I installed a keystroke logger and a screen capture software on the partition, set to trigger the moment an external IP connected. If he remoted in to frame me, I wouldn't just have a log of it. I'd have a high-definition video of him moving the mouse, navigating the files, and transferring the money. I would have his digital fingerprints caught in 4K. By 2 a.m., my back was screaming. I lay flat on the cheap living room rug, staring up at the ceiling fan. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. In the dead silence of the apartment, the vibration sounded like a chainsaw. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. I rolled over and grabbed the phone. Incoming at Caleb. I stared at the name glowing on the screen. It felt like holding a live snake. I swiped to open the message. Caleb, hey, saw you push the Q3 approvals through. Great work today. Get some rest. Big few weeks ahead of us. A slow, creeping chill moved down my arms. He was checking in. He was making sure I was calm, making sure I hadn't noticed anything weird about the files. It was the digital equivalent of a killer checking the locks on a basement door. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to tell him to rot. I wanted to tell him I knew what it felt like to die in a cage because of his greed. Instead, I forced my thumb to tap out the response of the naive, eager girl he thought he was playing. Me? Thanks, Caleb. Just doing my part. See you tomorrow. I hit send. I tossed the phone onto the cushion of the sofa. The silence of the apartment rushed back in. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs, and buried my face in my knees. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the first year of my sentence to last 3 lifetimes. I just sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, waiting for the sun to come up. The trap was set. The bait was in the water. Now I just had to survive long enough to watch him bleed. The break room smelled of scorched coffee grounds and cheap microwave popcorn. It was a mundane, suffocating stench that I used to ignore. Now, it made the back of my throat tight. It was a Tuesday, 9 days since I had woken up in my own past. 9 days of smiling at Caleb, answering his emails with cheerful exclamation points, and pretending I wasn't carrying the memory of my own death inside my chest. My jaw ached permanently from clenching my teeth while I slept. I stood by the water cooler, watching the small, translucent bubbles rise to the top of the plastic jug. You look like you're about to murder that cup, Nora. I blinked, the trance snapping. Tom, a mid-level compliance officer with a receding hairline and a permanent slouch, was standing by the industrial coffee machine. He held a ceramic mug with a chipped rim. "Just tired," I said, forcing my fingers to loosen their death grip on the flimsy paper cone. Water spilled over the edge, cold against my knuckles. "End of quarter crunch," Tom scoffed, dumping 2 packets of artificial sweetener into his dark roast. "Tell me about it." "Caleb's been pushing vendor approvals through my department like we're a fast food drive-thru. Half the safety certifications on these new logistics contractors look like they were photocopied in a basement." He stirred his coffee. "You're the final sign-off on the Chicago warehouse expansion, right?" My stomach turned to lead. Chicago. In exactly 14 months, the central heating matrix in the Chicago warehouse would short-circuit because the contractor Caleb hired, a shell company he secretly owned, used substandard, non-insulated wiring to skim $2 million off the budget. The spark would hit the packing materials. The fire suppression system, also installed by a shell company, would fail to activate. 3 night shift workers, a father of 4, a 22-year-old college student, a 50-year-old immigrant who sent half his paycheck home. I remembered their faces from the prosecution's slide deck. I remembered the weeping families in the gallery behind me while I sat chained to a heavy oak table. "Yeah," I managed to say. My voice felt like it was coming through a thick wall. "I'm reviewing it. Just make sure you cross your T's," Tom muttered, taking a sip. "Caleb's a golden boy to the partners, but if a subcontractor screws up, he'll let it roll downhill. Always does." He walked out. He didn't know how right he was. I dumped the water into the sink and walked back to my cubicle. A thick manila envelope was sitting squarely in the center of my keyboard. I didn't need to open it. I knew the weight of it. I sat down. The office around me faded into a dull, rushing roar. I slid my thumb under the adhesive flap and tore it open. The paper sliced a microscopic line across my skin, a paper cut. I stared at the tiny bead of bright red blood welling up on my thumb, suddenly hyper-fixated on the sharp sting. I pulled out the contracts. Titan Contracting Solutions. The final authorization for the Chicago build. There were sticky notes flags on 3 pages. "Sign here, Nora." Guy. My breathing grew shallow. My chest felt too small for my lungs. If I signed this, I was authorizing the mechanism of murder. Even knowing I was building a trap for him, even knowing my digital payload would trace the fraud back to his machine, putting my ink on this paper felt like holding a match. I can't do it. The thought hit me with blinding force. I pushed back from the desk. My chair slammed into the partition. I didn't care. I grabbed the file, stood up, and practically ran toward the stairwell. I pushed through the heavy fire doors and collapsed onto the concrete landing. The air in the stairwell was cold and smelled of dust and old cigarettes. I dropped the file. It slapped against the concrete, the pages spilling out. I pressed my back against the cinder block wall and slid down until I was sitting on the cold step. I pulled my knees to my chest and buried my face in my arms. I was hyperventilating. The sound of my own ragged breathing echoed off the concrete. I could see the fire. I could smell the smoke. I could hear the judge's voice. 20 years. "Stop it!" I hissed to myself. I grabbed a fistful of my own hair and pulled until the pain grounded me. "Stop it! You are not there." I looked at the scattered papers. The signature lines stared back at me, blank and hungry. If I took this to HR right now, what would happen? I had a dirty script running on my computer and a honeypot at home. But I had no hard proof, yet. Caleb would say I was unstable. He would delete his remote access logs. He would point to the digital approvals I'd already signed. I'd be fired. The warehouse would still be built. He would just find another junior analyst to take the fall. I couldn't save those 3 men by stopping now. I could only save them by letting Caleb finish building his own coffin and then locking him inside it before the warehouse ever opened. My hands were shaking as I gathered the papers. I smoothed out the crumpled corners. I pulled a blue pen from my pocket. I didn't go back to my desk. I sat right there on the dirty concrete stairs, pressed the contract against my thigh, and signed my name on the 3 flagged lines. The ink bled slightly into the cheap paper. I didn't feel brave. I felt sick. I stood up, brushed the dust off my skirt, and walked back onto the floor. I dropped the signed folder into Caleb's inbox. He wasn't at his desk. When I turned away, the tiny cut on my thumb throbbed. It happened on a Thursday, 3:14 a.m. It was raining, the kind of heavy, relentless autumn rain that makes the city feel like it's underwater. The streetlights outside my apartment window cast warped, sliding shadows across my living room wall. I was asleep on the sofa. I had given up on my bed entirely. The bedroom felt too much like a cell, 4 blank walls and a single high window. The sofa was uncomfortable, but it was positioned right in front of my laptop, which sat open on the coffee table. A sharp, synthetic ping cut through the sound of the rain. My eyes snapped open. I didn't sit up immediately. I lay completely still, my heart hammering a frantic, bruising rhythm against my ribs. Ping. It was the alert tone I had coded into the virtual machine. I threw off the thin fleece blanket and dropped to my knees on the floor, ignoring the burn of the rough carpet. I grabbed the wireless mouse, making sure not to move it within the virtual machine window. I toggled my screen to view the honeypot partition. The screen was black for a second. Then it flickered to life. I wasn't touching the mouse. I wasn't touching the keyboard, but the cursor on the screen was moving. A cold sweat broke out across my neck. It was a visceral, horrifying violation. Someone was inside my house, inside my life, moving through my digital footprint like a prowler, shifting through a dresser drawer. The cursor clicked on the VPN client. It opened. A password was pasted into the login box, too fast for human typing. An automated script. Connected to Omnicorp Secure Network. I stopped breathing. The screen capture software I had installed was running silently in the background, recording every single pixel at 60 frames per second. My keystroke logger was capturing every command. The ghost cursor moved to the company's internal banking portal. This was it. This was the moment that had sent me to prison. In my trial, they show the logs of my computer accessing this portal at 3:17 a.m. They told the jury I was a greedy, calculated thief, working under the cover of darkness. I watched the cursor input my employee ID, then my password. He kept a keylogger on my work machine, I realized, a sick feeling washing over me. He's had my passwords for months. The portal opened. The cursor navigated to the Q3 Logistics escrow account. It held the funds meant for the contractors building the Chicago site, along with 3 other major municipal projects. The cursor clicked. Transfer. Destination, Apex Holdings International. An offshore account routed through the Cayman Islands. Amount, $2,450,000. I stared at the numbers. $2.4 million. For that amount of money, Caleb had stolen 20 years of my life. For that amount of money, 3 men were going to burn to death. It felt incredibly cheap. The cursor hovered over the confirm button, My hand twitched toward my router cable. The urge to rip it out of the wall, to sever the connection and stop the theft, was overwhelming. It was pure survival instinct. If I stopped it now, the money wouldn't leave. The crime wouldn't happen. But if I stopped it now, I had nothing. Let him do it, I screamed at myself in the silence of my apartment. Let him hang himself. I dug my fingernails into my palms until they broke the skin. I watched the screen. Click. Transfer initiated. Processing. 10 seconds later, transfer complete. Receipt generated. The ghost cursor immediately moved to the system logs. It opened the local activity file on my virtual machine and deleted the VPN session history. It deleted the browser cache. It was scrubbing the scene of the crime, leaving only the server-side logs that pointed directly to my home IP address. Then the connection severed. The cursor stopped moving. The screen sat still, a mocking digital void. I exhaled. It sounded like a sob, but there were no tears. I dragged myself up onto the sofa, my legs trembling so badly they could barely support my weight. I reached out and saved the video file. I exported the keystroke logs. I opened the data. The remote connection had routed through 2 proxy servers, but my script had caught the initial handshake before the encryption fully engaged. There it was, the origin IP. It wasn't Caleb's office computer. It was his home network in the suburbs. I had him. I had the video of him logging into my machine. I had the keystroke logs proving the inputs were automated scripts, not manual typing. And back at the office, his localized backup drive was infected with my tracker, tying him to every fraudulent vendor approval he had ever forced me to sign. I closed the laptop. The apartment was dark again. The rain continued to beat against the glass. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but they weren't empty anymore. They were holding the keys to his cage. The Omnicorp Logistics annual gala was held at the Waldorf. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the suffocating scent of roasted duck, heavy perfumes, and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like massive, glittering stalactites. I hated every second of it. I was wearing a dark green silk dress I had bought at a thrift store and tailored myself. It squeezed my ribs, making it hard to take a full breath. The fabric felt foreign against my skin, too smooth, too delicate. Prison issues, you rough cotton that smells of industrial lie. You get used to it. Luxury feels like a lie after that. I stood near the edge of the room, clutching a flute of champagne I hadn't tasted. Nora! Caleb's voice cut through the low hum of a string quartet. I turned. He was weaving through the crowd, a sleek, black tuxedo, making him look taller, broader. His wife, Sarah, was on his arm. She was beautiful, wearing diamonds that probably cost more than my entire salary. She smiled at me, a vague, polite smile, reserved for the hired help. "You look fantastic," Caleb said, stopping in front of me. His eyes were bright, triumphant. It was Friday night. The $2.4 million transfer had cleared that morning. He thought he was a ghost. He thought he was a god. "Thank you, Caleb. You both look lovely," I said. My voice was smooth. The tremor was gone. After Thursday night, the fear had burned out completely, leaving only a cold, hard expanse of pure spite. "Having fun?" he asked, taking a sip from his own glass. "You deserve it. You've been killing yourself this quarter. The Chicago approvals went through without a hitch. The board is ecstatic." "Just doing my job," I replied, holding his gaze. I didn't look away. I wanted to memorize the smug, relaxed lines around his eyes. I wanted to remember what he looked like before I broke him. "Oh, look, there's Richard," Caleb said, his attention snapping toward the center of the room. Richard Vance was the executive vice president of operations, the man who signed Caleb's paychecks, the man who would fire him. "Come on, Nora. I want to introduce you. Good optics to show off my team." He didn't wait for an answer. He put a warm, heavy hand on my lower back and steered me through the crowd. My skin crawled where he touched me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shatter my champagne glass against the edge of a table and drive the jagged stem into his throat. Instead, I walked. "Richard," Caleb beamed, extending his hand as we approached the VP. Richard turned. He was an older man, sharp-eyed and unforgiving. He shook Caleb's hand briefly. "Caleb, good quarter. The logistics expansion is ahead of schedule." "Team effort," Caleb said smoothly, gesturing to me. "This is Nora. She's been my right hand on the compliance and vendor approvals. Couldn't have cleared the red tape without her." Richard looked at me. His gaze was assessing, cold. "Is that right? Good work, Nora." "Thank you, sir," I said. I stepped slightly out of Caleb's shadow. "Actually, Richard, I was hoping to grab 5 minutes on your calendar for Monday morning. If you have the time." Caleb's hand tensed on my back. Just a fraction of an inch. A micro-reaction. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Monday? What about?" "Just a minor anomaly in the Q3 escrow routing," I said lightly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. I took a small sip of my champagne. It tasted like battery acid. Probably just a software glitch with the new vendor portals, but I like to be thorough. It involves the Apex Holdings transfer that cleared this morning. The air around us seemed to freeze. The string quartet kept playing. The room kept buzzing, but in our small circle, the oxygen vanished. I didn't look at Caleb. I kept my eyes fixed on Richard. "Apex Holdings?" Richard frowned. "That was a high-priority clearance. You found a glitch?" "A routing exception," I corrected softly. "It's highly technical. Caleb has been so busy managing the macro-level negotiations. I didn't want to bother him with the back-end server logs. I've compiled a full physical report. I can bring it to your office at 9. Richard stared at me for a long moment. He was a shark. He smelled blood in the water, even if he didn't know whose it was yet. 9 a.m., my office, bring the hard copies. "Of course," I smiled. Richard nodded and walked away to greet a board member. I finally turned to Caleb. His face was perfectly blank. The charming smile had rigidified into a porcelain mask. His eyes were dark, searching my face for a tell, for a sign of panic, for a sign that I knew what I was talking about. "A routing exception?" he asked. His voice was a flat, dead monotone. "You didn't mention that to me." "Like I said to Richard," I replied, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear over the music. "I didn't want to bother you. You've been so focused on the external transfers. I've got the internal network covered, completely." I emphasized the last word. I watched his pupils dilate. He wasn't sure. He couldn't be sure if I was an idiot who had accidentally stumbled onto his offshore shell company, or if I was something else entirely. But the seed of doubt was planted. It was a poisonous weed, and it was going to choke him over the next 48 hours. "I'm going to get some air," Caleb said abruptly. He dropped my arm, as if my skin was burning him. He turned to his wife. "Sarah, I need a minute." He walked away quickly, pushing past a waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. I stood alone in the center of the ballroom. I reached into my small satin clutch. My fingers brushed against the cold, hard plastic of a flash drive. It contained the video, the keystrokes, the MAC address logs from his office computer. It was a loaded gun, and I had just cocked the hammer. I raised my glass of champagne. There was no one to clink it against, so I just toasted the empty air. "Have a terrible weekend, Caleb," I whispered. I finally drank the champagne. It went down burning, and it tasted like victory. Saturday and Sunday were a masterclass in psychological torture. For him, not me. I unplugged my home router on Saturday morning. I didn't just turn it off. I yanked the coaxial cable from the wall and dropped the black plastic box into the kitchen trash can. By noon, my phone started buzzing. "Caleb, hey Nora, trying to access the shared drive to prep for Monday, but the VPN is acting sluggish. You seeing any lag on your end?" I let it sit for 2 hours while I went for a walk in the park. The air was crisp, biting my cheeks. I bought a black coffee from a street vendor and sat on a wooden bench, watching pigeons fight over a bagel crust. It was mundane. It was beautiful. I hadn't seen a pigeon in 4 years. The prison yard only had crows, and they kept their distance. At 2:30 p.m., I finally typed a reply. Me. "Oh, weird. I'm out running errands and haven't logged on. Want me to check when I get home tonight?" His reply was instantaneous, betraying the phone gripped tightly in his sweating hand. "Caleb, no, don't worry about it. Probably just a server-side thing. See you Monday." He was lying. He was panicking. Without the connection to my honeypot, he couldn't verify if his remote tracks from Thursday night were truly scrubbed. He couldn't go back in to check the logs. He was flying blind into a meeting with the Executive Vice President of Operations, and I had just told him there was a routing anomaly. I slept 10 hours that night. It was the first time since waking up in this timeline that I didn't dream of concrete walls. Monday morning arrived with a low, bruised sky threatening rain. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot. I didn't wear makeup. I wanted to look exactly like the overworked, diligent junior analyst they expected me to be. I stepped out of the elevator onto the 42nd floor at 8:45 a.m. The executive wing was a different world from the bullpen. The carpet was twice as thick, swallowing the sound of footsteps. The air smelled of expensive lemon polish and fresh-cut lilies resting in a glass vase on the receptionist's desk. Caleb was already there. He was pacing in front of Richard's heavy mahogany door. His suit was impeccable, but the knot of his tie was pulled a fraction of an inch away from his collar. His face was drawn, the skin around his eyes tight and bruised with exhaustion. He hadn't slept. When he saw me, he stopped dead. His jaw muscles flexed. "Nora," he said. His voice was clipped, stripped of all its usual corporate warmth. "What exactly are we presenting to Richard today? I need to review your findings before we go in." Protocol. I clutched the thick, black leather portfolio to my chest. "It's really nothing to worry about, Caleb. Just a discrepancy in the MAC address logs on the Q3 escrow payout." I printed the raw data. He took a step toward me, closing the distance. He dropped his voice, his tone taking on a sharp, commanding edge. "Give me the folder, Nora. You're junior staff. You don't bypass your project manager to speak to the VP. Hand it over." He reached out. I didn't shrink back. I didn't cower like I would have 4 years ago. I looked down at his outstretched hand, then slowly brought my eyes up to meet his. I let the facade slip, just for a fraction of a second. I let him see the absolute, freezing contempt burning behind my retinas. His hand faltered. He saw it. He saw the ghost looking back at him. Before he could speak, the mahogany door clicked open. "You're both early," Richard said, standing in the doorway. He held a ceramic mug and looked between us, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He noted Caleb's outstretched hand, my protective grip on the portfolio, the heavy, toxic tension suffocating the hallway. "Good. Let's get this over with. The board is breathing down my neck about the Chicago site timeline." Richard stepped back, gesturing for us to enter. Caleb shot me a look of pure, concentrated venom, then smoothed his jacket and walked in. I followed, the heavy door shutting behind us with a soft, final thud. The office was massive, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray city skyline. A long oak conference table occupied the right side of the room. Richard didn't sit behind his desk. He sat at the head of the conference table, signaling that this was a working meeting. "Have a seat," Richard commanded. We sat. Caleb took the chair to Richard's left. I took the chair to his right, placing the black portfolio flat on the polished wood. "All right, Nora," Richard said, steepling his fingers. "You mentioned an anomaly with the Apex Holdings transfer. I pulled the high-level ledger this morning. The $2.4 million cleared. The vendor confirmed receipt. So, what's the problem?" I unzipped the portfolio. The metal zipper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. "The problem, Richard, is that Apex Holdings doesn't exist," I said. My voice was steady, resonant. Caleb laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound, utterly hollow. "Richard, I apologize for this. Nora is relatively new to the macro-level vetting process. Apex is a subsidiary holding company for our primary contractors in the Midwest. It's a standard corporate umbrella. I pulled their incorporation documents from Delaware," I said, ignoring Caleb entirely. I slid the first manila folder across the table to Richard. "They were incorporated 3 weeks ago. The registered agent is a P.O. box. They have no equipment, no payroll, and no history of industrial construction." Richard opened the folder. He scanned the highlighted sections, his frown deepening. "Caleb vetted this vendor. The safety waivers and financial audits were signed off." "Yes," I said. "They were signed off using my digital signature. Which brings me to the anomaly." I slid the second folder across the table. "I noticed a lag in my terminal when approving the Q3 logistics files," I explained, leaning forward slightly. "I ran a standard trace to see if the network was bottlenecking. I found a recursive script running in the background. It was copying my digital signature approvals and mirroring them." "What?" Richard's head snapped up. "This is absurd," Caleb interrupted, his voice rising in pitch. A bead of sweat broke out on his temple. "She's out of her depth, Richard. She's misinterpreting routine server backups. The script wasn't backing up to the server," I said softly. I looked right at Caleb. It was routing to a localized IP address, IP.114. "Your office terminal, Caleb." Silence fell over the room. It was absolute, the kind of silence that precedes a car crash. Richard slowly turned his head to look at Caleb. "Is there a script pulling data from her terminal to yours?" "No, absolutely not," Caleb lied. His face was flushing a dark, mottled red. "She's fabricating this. I don't know what her game is, but she's trying to cover her own tracks. If there's a problem with Apex, she's the final sign-off. Her name is on the physical contracts. My name is on the physical contracts because you handed them to me and told me to sign them," I countered calmly. "But the digital authorizations, the ones that actually release the funds, those were executed on Thursday night at 3:14 a.m. I slid the third folder across the table. It was thick. I was asleep, I continued, but my home computer logged a remote access event. Someone used my employee credentials to log into the corporate banking portal and wire the $2.4 million to the Apex Shell account. She's a thief, Caleb spat, standing up so violently his chair tipped backward and slammed into the floor. Richard, listen to this. She just admitted the transfer came from her own IP address. She's stealing the escrow funds and trying to frame me with some bullshit IT jargon. Richard didn't look at Caleb. He was staring at the third folder. Nora, if the transfer came from your home IP, how do you prove it wasn't you sitting at the keyboard? I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed the smooth plastic of the flash drive. I pulled it out and set it on the oak table. It landed with a soft click. Because, Richard, I built a honeypot, I said. The words tasted like cold steel. I suspected my credentials were compromised, so I partitioned my hard drive and installed a keystroke logger and screen capture software. The person who wired that money used an automated macro to input the passwords. It wasn't typed by a human hand. And more importantly, I paused. I wanted Caleb to feel the next sentence in his bones. The software traced the incoming connection before the VPN encryption fully masked it. The IP address that remoted into my machine to steal the company's money belongs to a residential router in Oak Brook, registered to Caleb. Caleb stopped breathing. He literally stopped breathing. His chest froze. The color drained from his face so fast, he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The arrogant, untouchable senior project manager died in that exact second. Richard stared at the flash drive. Then he looked at Caleb's face. He didn't need to plug the drive in to know it was true. Caleb's reaction was a full, screaming confession. Richard reached out and pressed a silver button on his intercom console. Brenda, Richard said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Call corporate security, have them come to my office immediately. Then get legal and the head of IT on the line. Tell IT to lock down Caleb's terminal, his network access, and his building pass. Right now. It took security exactly 4 minutes to arrive. For those 4 minutes, no one spoke. Richard sat at the head of the table, his eyes locked on Caleb with the cold, detached fury of a man calculating exactly how much damage control this was going to cost his division. Caleb didn't fight. He didn't yell. The fight had been completely excised from him the moment I mentioned his home IP address. He collapsed back into his righted chair, staring blankly at the polished oak table. His breathing shallow and rapid. He looked small. He looked pathetic. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I should have felt elated. I should have felt a rush of euphoric victory. I had done it. I had reversed the timeline. I had saved the Chicago workers, and I had handed my executioner his own noose. But I didn't feel euphoric. I felt the phantom weight of chains on my wrists. As I watched Caleb's world shatter, the sensory memories of my own destruction crashed over me. The smell of the holding cell toilet, the rough wool of the transport blanket, the blinding flash of the booking camera, the agonizing, tearing pain of my appendix bursting, while the guards told me to stop faking it. My chest tightened. A cold sweat broke across the back of my neck. I was having a panic attack, right here in the executive suite. I dug my fingernails into my palms, grinding the crescents into the skin until the sharp, grounding pain snapped me back to the present. You are not there, I repeated in my head. You are here. He is the one going in the cage. The mahogany door opened. Two large men in dark gray Omnicorp security uniforms stepped in. "Richard?" the lead guard asked, his eyes immediately assessing the room. "Escort him out," Richard said, pointing a single finger at Caleb. "He is not to return to his desk. He is not to touch his phone. Confiscate his corporate devices. We are holding him in conference room B until the police arrive." "The police?" Caleb whispered. It was a pathetic, broken sound. He looked at Richard, his eyes wide and wet. "Richard, please. We can handle this internally. I can get the money back. The transfer hasn't fully cleared the offshore routing yet. I can reverse it." He was begging. "You stole $2.5 million, compromised our infrastructure, and tried to frame a junior employee to take the federal charges," Richard said, his voice like grinding stones. "You are done. Get him out of my sight." The guards stepped forward. One grabbed Caleb's left arm, the other his right. "Wait," Caleb gasped, digging his heels into the carpet. He twisted, looking back at me. The mask was gone. The handsome face was contorted in sheer, naked terror. Nora, please. You don't know what you're doing. The feds will ruin my life. They'll take my house. Sarah, please, tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you misunderstood the logs." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had sat in the gallery of my trial and smiled while the judge ruined my life. I let a small, confused, utterly terrified expression wash over my face. The perfect picture of the naive junior analyst who had stumbled into something horrifying. "Caleb," I said, my voice trembling perfectly, "I just reported the data. I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were stealing." It was the final nail. The guards yanked him backward. "You bitch!" Caleb screamed, his voice cracking, devolving into a primal, desperate shriek. "You set me up! You set me up!" They dragged him through the door. His heels scraped against the thick carpet. I listened to his voice echo down the hallway, screaming my name, screaming obscenities, until the heavy doors of the elevator lobby cut the sound off completely. The silence rushed back into the room. Richard sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked old. "Nora," he said heavily, "I need you to go down to legal. Take this flash drive. Tell them everything. You did the right thing today. You protected the company." "Thank you, sir," I whispered. I stood up, took the flash drive, and walked out of the office. When I reached the stairwell, I pushed through the fire doors, descended one flight, and sat on the cold concrete landing. I was alone, the smell of dust and old cigarettes wrapped around me. I put my face in my hands, and for the first time in 4 years, in 2 lifetimes, I finally cried. They weren't tears of joy. They were violent, ugly sobs that tore out of my throat, shaking my entire body. I cried for the years I lost in that cell. I cried for the agonizing pain of my death. I cried because breaking Caleb didn't magically put my soul back together. I was still fractured. I would always be the woman who died on a concrete floor. But as the tears finally slowed and the cold air of the stairwell dried my cheeks, a new sensation settled in my chest. It was quiet. The suffocating, crushing weight of impending doom was gone. The ledger was balanced. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked down to legal. The wheels of justice are notoriously slow, but when a multi-billion-dollar corporation hands the FBI a perfectly wrapped package of wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate sabotage, the wheels suddenly grease themselves. It took 7 months. I didn't stay at Omnicorp. 2 weeks after Caleb's arrest, Richard offered me a promotion, a substantial raise. The corner cubicle. I handed him my resignation letter instead. I couldn't stay in that building. The air conditioning still smelled like ozone and cedarwood cologne to me. I took my savings, moved to a smaller apartment in a different city, and took a quiet job doing data entry for a local nonprofit. It paid half as much, but the stakes were zero. Nobody died if I made a typo. In May, the trial began. The prosecution subpoenaed me. I didn't have to testify for long. The forensic accountants in the FBI Cyber Division did most of the heavy lifting. My flash drive was the smoking gun. The defense tried to argue that I had planted the malware on Caleb's machine, but they couldn't explain away the video of him logging into the banking portal from his home IP address. I attended the sentencing. I sat in the back row of the gallery. The courtroom looked exactly the same as the one from my past life. The heavy oak benches, the smell of lemon pledge and stale floor wax, the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Caleb was brought in through the side door. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit. The vibrant, sickening color clashed violently against his pale skin. He had lost weight. The crisp, tailored arrogance was gone, replaced by a permanent, hunted slouch. His hair was thinning, unwashed. He looked like a cornered animal. He sat at the defense table. He didn't look back at the gallery. He didn't look at Sarah, who was sitting 2 rows ahead of me, weeping silently into a tissue. She had filed for divorce 3 months ago, right after the Fed seized their house to pay restitution. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge commanded. It was a different judge from my trial, but the tone was exactly the same. Bored, authoritative, absolute. Caleb stood. His hands were cuffed in front of him. The chain rattled against the wooden table. It was a small, sharp sound, but it echoed in my skull like a gunshot. Clink. "Caleb Davies," the judge read from the paperwork. "You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of aggravated identity theft, and 1 count of corporate espionage. Your actions were calculated, malicious, and demonstrated a profound disregard for the lives and livelihoods of those you sought to exploit." The judge paused, looking down over his glasses. "It is the sentence of this court that you serve a term of 240 months in federal prison, 20 years, without the possibility of early parole. 20 years, exactly what he gave me." Caleb's knees gave out. He didn't fall completely, but he slumped heavily against the defense attorney, letting out a wretched, guttural moan that sounded barely human. It was the sound of a man realizing his life was over. The marshals stepped in immediately, grabbing his arms, pulling him upright. As they turned him to walk him back through the side door, his eyes swept the gallery. He found me, through the crowd, through the weeping family members, and the indifferent reporters. Our eyes locked. His face twisted. It was a chaotic mask of hatred, regret, and utter terror. He mouthed something, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the courtroom. It didn't matter what he said. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just looked at him with absolute, cold indifference. I let him see that to me, he was already a ghost. He was nothing but a memory of a bad dream. The heavy wooden door shut behind him with a loud crack. He was gone. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped out onto the wide stone steps. It had been raining while I was inside, but the clouds had broken. The pavement was slick and black, reflecting the bright, hard sunlight. The air smelled of wet asphalt and car exhaust. It smelled like the city. It smelled real. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs until my ribs stretched. There was no burning. There was no pain. My heart beat strong and steady against my sternum. I walked down the steps and merged into the crowd on the sidewalk. I was just another face in the sea of people going to work, buying coffee, living their lives. I didn't look back at the courthouse. The ledger was closed. The evidence was rewritten. I had died in the dark, but I was going to live in the light. That's the thing about second chances. They don't erase the trauma. They just give you the tools to forge a different ending. Nora survived, not by being a hero, but by becoming the very trap that was set for her. Did she go too far, or did Caleb get exactly what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with a friend who loves a dark revenge thriller, and subscribe for more original, twisted audio dramas every week.